Welcome, everybody, to the first Sunday of Advent. This Sunday is traditionally known as the Sunday of Hope. Where do you find hope in the world? This is what our readings are inviting us to discover for ourselves. But Advent is particularly an important season because we are not yet in the season of Christmas, despite what our culture of consumerism would lead us to believe, and despite what certain news media outlets would like us to believe. It's not Christmas. There is no war on Christmas because it is not yet the Christmas season. You see, if there is a war on any Christian season during this time, as Diana Butler Bass told us many years ago, it is a war on Advent. And it is primarily fought by people who claim to be Christian. But Christians, I invite you to think about it this way. Christmas is a season that begins on December 24th. It's a season of joy and celebration. And that's a good thing. But before we get to joy and celebration of Christmas, it's important to go through the season of Advent, because Advent reminds us that the world is not how it is supposed to be. The world is not right. And if you quickly move to joy and celebration without recognizing that the world is pretty messed up as it is, you're going to miss the point of Christianity. That's why the Christian calendar begins with the season of Advent, to say that there is darkness in the world, and the light of God is shining in the darkness. And we have the opportunity to add to God's light in the world. You might say it differently, like this: we have the opportunity to participate with God in lighting the candles of hope in this world. We see this in our passages for Advent, but particularly in our passages for today, as Sharon read earlier from the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah recognized that the world was not how it was supposed to be. This is so important because even today, we can become accustomed to accepting the way that the world is. The reading from Jeremiah, the reading from Luke is a reminder: no, don't accept the way the world is. Advent is a time of holy protest, you might say, holy rebellion against the way that the world has become. Here we find it in Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet during a time when the Babylonian Empire was on the move, and the Babylonians conquered various lands, destroying Jerusalem and the temple, going to war against the people there, and then sending many of the people throughout the Babylonian Empire. And then the Babylonians, like many other empires, would leave the poor in the land in Israel and Judah, and they would send other people that they'd conquered into the land so that they would intermarry. And what was the point of this? It was to destroy the cultures of the land, to give them, to destroy their identity of who they are, so that they might assimilate to Babylonian culture. So it's during this time where Jeremiah is experiencing the destruction of his identity, his people's identity, and he tries to give a word of hope. Jeremiah says this in the passage that Sharon read earlier: "The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah shall be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. This is Jeremiah's words of hope to his people who have just experienced utter destruction. Many of them were living in utter despair after this traumatic event. And Jeremiah gives words of hope. And maybe my most favorite verses or chapter in the Hebrew scriptures is Jeremiah chapter 29. Many of you may know this passage. It's a passage where Jeremiah gives God's words of hope during this time of despair. Because in times of despair, Jeremiah says, there are things that you can do. Advent isn't merely a time of waiting on God to enter into our world to fix things. Advent is a time of empowerment to you and to me. That even in these dark times, there is a light that you can shine. And so what does Jeremiah say in chapter 29? That when you are in exile, when you are spread throughout the Babylonian Empire, Jeremiah says this: build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. When things feel like it has fallen apart, what does God recommend or even command that we do? Notice what God does not say. God does not say, those Babylonians came and destroyed you and spread you throughout their empire, those jerks, go and destroy them. Go and rebel against them, fight against them for your own freedom. No. What does God say? Your welfare is connected to their welfare. When you find yourself in physical exile like the ancient Jews did, or when you find yourself in spiritual exile like many of us do today, what does God say that you should do? Build houses. Have children. Continue to live your life. Do not fall into the trap of thinking your life is over, because there is so much more life to live. God has not given up on you. Don't give up on yourself either. That's the message of Jeremiah. God goes with you into exile. Let us be with one another as we enter into exile too, into the darkness of the world. Know deep in your bones that you are not alone. Even in traumatic exile experiences that we go through, you are not alone. God is with you, and we are with one another. That is the hope that we have. And in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, that Sharon read for us this morning, we find this again. This is apocalyptic literature. In fact, many scholars call this the little apocalypse of Luke. A couple weeks ago, we had the little apocalypse of Mark. Today, we get Luke's version. And I want you to notice something that is similar with Luke and Mark, because the phrase apocalypse has become known and associated with God's utter darkness, God's utter violence in the world, that God is going to seek retribution on the day of judgment against God's enemies. And the apocalyptic literature shows us what that looks like. As I reread this passage to you, bits of it to you, I want you to listen for God's activity in the world. See in this passage where God is acting violently in the world. Here it is. In those days, Jesus says, there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress among the nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to take place, stand up, raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Where is God's violence in this passage? It is non-existent. Where is God's vengeance in this passage? It's not there. Now, here we find that the sun and the moon and the stars, there will be signs in them. Why is this important? In the sun and the moon and the stars in the Gospel of Mark, it says that they will feel like they are falling. When Jesus goes to the cross, the Gospels say when Jesus is put on the cross and killed, Jesus always says that he is being handed over to human beings. Humans hand over Jesus to other humans to be killed. And what happens on that day? Midday, the sun disappears. This is the sign. This is the event that Jesus is talking about. It is when Jesus, it says here, the other part where people often get confused in this passage is where it says that the heavens will be shaken. What is Jesus among us? Heaven on earth. Jesus is the temple. Jesus, for Christians, is heaven and earth coming together in one body, God and human here on earth. And what happens when Jesus goes to the cross? This is the apocalyptic moment that he is talking about. Jesus is shaken on the cross. Jesus is high and lifted up. He is on the cross, he is the Son of Man who is coming on the clouds. The clouds are there while Jesus is on the cross. When Jesus speaks about this apocalyptic literature, the day of judgment, he is talking about the cross. When Jesus says that all of these things will take place within this generation, many people think that Jesus got it wrong because they're misinterpreting what Jesus says. What is this apocalyptic moment that he's talking about? But Jesus being hung on the cross amongst the clouds as the Son of Man who is coming to us on this day of judgment. And what is the judgment that God delivers on Judgment Day? The Gospel of Luke says it so beautifully. The judgment that Jesus gives to you and to me is the judgment of forgiveness. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, are the words that Jesus speaks, that the Gospel of Luke gives us. It is radical forgiveness. If you want to talk about a judgmental God, you have to do it at this apocalyptic moment. that reveals who God fundamentally is. When the sun falls and there's darkness covers the earth in these apocalyptic stories that Jesus tells us, he is referring to the apocalyptic moment of the cross. When the world feels like it's falling apart, how does God respond to us? With love, with mercy, with forgiveness. And it's in these moments where Jesus says to us, now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Do you sense the chutzpah that Jesus is giving to us in these moments of despair, in these moments of darkness? It's just like Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says, when you're going through this despair, there's something that you can do. Jeremiah essentially says the same thing that Jesus says. Stand up, raise your heads, have a little chutzpah in you during these moments, because there is something that you can do. There's something that we can do together. Your redemption is drawing near. And how do you participate in that redemption? This is hard, but you stare that darkness in the face and you say that this darkness does not have the last word. Whatever it is that you are going through during this time of darkness, it does not have the last word. God's love, God's light has the last word. It is often people who are going through the hardest times of their lives who teach us this truth the most. I have personal experiences. I'm sure that you have your personal experiences, but the biggest Advent season that I have had in my life was when I was roughly 10 years old to 20 years old, when my mother was dying from cancer. She was living with cancer for many of those years, but it eventually took her life after 10 years. And it was in this dark period of her life and my life, of our life together, where my mom's light shined the brightest, where she was able to do exactly this. Somehow, I don't know how she was able to do it, but she was able to follow these words, to stand up and raise your heads because your redemption is drawing near. I asked her once if she was ever afraid of dying, and she said that she was not, because she knew that Jesus would save her. My mom was not a particularly religious person. She had the mouth of a sailor. She didn't like going to church. We only went to church because my dad wanted us to go to church. And here was my mother, recognizing in the darkest season of her life that cancer would not have the last word, that there was something on the other side, that in the face of darkness and despair, that you can rise up, that you can look it in the eyes and you can say, you will not win, because love wins. God's love wins. And when you are in physical exile, as the ancient Jews of Jeremiah's day were in physical exile, or if you are in spiritual exile, like the early Christians, like my mother, like so many of us who are experiencing this darkness, know that you are not alone. May you know that you travel in this Advent season, this dark season, with others. That God is here with you. And may we rise up with one another, shining more light into this dark world that desperately needs more of God's light and love. Amen.